She laughed when she saw the sign on my gate, a big red board that said, "Private property, trespassers will be towed." Her BMW stood half a tire over the boundary, sun shining on its polished hood like it owned the street. I was on my porch, coffee in hand, when she shouted, "You can't put that sign here. This is HOA land." I took a slow sip and said, "Ma'am, this is my driveway." Her face twisted, that kind of fake smile that hides pure hate. That morning, she strutted back with her phone in hand, recording herself like some local celebrity. "I'm reporting this illegal sign to the HOA," she said loud enough for the neighbors to hear. I ignored her, but deep down, I knew where this was heading. Karen wasn't the kind who stops. She thrives on control. By noon, she slipped a paper under my door, a fake HOA notice, printed crooked, demanding I remove unauthorized signage or face penalties. I almost laughed, but what she didn't know was that I had installed hidden cameras 2 days earlier. Every move she made was recorded, every word she said. That evening, I caught her outside again, yelling at a tow truck driver she'd called. She pointed at my truck like it was some abandoned vehicle. "This eyesore's been parked here for days," she barked. The driver hesitated. "Ma'am, this is inside his boundary," he muttered. She didn't care. She waved some fake document, shouting, "I'm HOA president, just do your job." I walked down calmly, every step echoing. "Touch that truck," I said quietly, "and your BMW won't make it through the night." She scoffed, "Is that a threat?" I smiled, "No, it's a promise backed by property law." She rolled her eyes, jumped into her BMW, and peeled off with that smug grin still on her face. But what she didn't notice was the thick metal nail she'd picked up from my gravel, the one that sliced deep into her rear tire halfway down the street. The sound of the pop echoed like justice. She slammed the brakes, got out, and screamed, "You'll pay for this." I just stood by the fence and said, "You ignored the sign, Karen. Now your BMW did too." Viral line. You can argue with me all day, but not with the law of private property. She came back the next morning, furious, holding her flat tire like it was evidence from a crime scene. "You sabotaged my car," she yelled, standing right in the middle of my driveway. I didn't say a word, I just pointed at my camera mounted above the garage. Her eyes flicked up, and for the first time, she hesitated. "That camera doesn't scare me," she hissed, but her voice had already softened a little. 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers rolled in. She'd actually called the cops on me. I watched from my porch as she talked to them, waving her hands like a bad actress. "He's violent. He threatened me," she cried. The officer came up to me and said, "Sir, mind explaining what happened here?" I just nodded and pulled out my phone. "Sure," I said, tapping the screen. The footage played, her trespassing, her fake HOA notice, her yelling at the tow truck guy. The officers watched silently, their expressions slowly shifting. When the video showed her stepping onto my property to plant that fake paper on my door, one of them let out a small sigh. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "this looks like harassment." She gasped, her face turning red. "That's not me. He edited that," she shrieked. But one officer had already noticed the date and time stamp on the footage. The evidence was airtight. "Ma'am," he said, "step back, please." She refused to move, so they gently guided her off my property. But I didn't smile. Not yet. Because while the cops were leaving, she leaned closer to me and whispered, "You think you've won? You don't know who I know in the HOA board." Her tone was cold, too. Confident. Something about it didn't sit right. I watched her drive off with that same broken BMW, the rim scratching the pavement, and I knew she wasn't done. That night, I noticed my motion sensor light blinking red. I checked the footage again. Someone was walking near my fence, holding a flashlight. I zoomed in, and there she was, with another man, planting something under my truck. My heart raced as I realized, she wasn't after revenge anymore. She was setting me up. I whispered to myself, "All right, Karen, let's play your game." Viral line. You can fake paperwork, fake power, but you can't fake the truth caught on camera. The next morning, I walked out like nothing happened. Karen was already outside, pretending to water her flowers but watching me from the corner of her eye. I crouched beside my truck, pretending to check a tire, and there it was, a small black tracker taped under the bumper. Not a cheap one either. She'd gone all in. I peeled it off quietly and slipped it into my pocket. A few minutes later, she came over, voice syrupy sweet. "Morning, neighbor," she said, faking a smile. "Rough night." I looked straight at her and replied, "Not really. Slept great. You?" Her smile froze for half a second before she turned away. That's when I knew she realized I'd found it. An hour later, a white SUV pulled up in front of my house. Two men in suits stepped out, claiming to be property inspectors. No badges, no ID, just polished shoes and fake confidence. "Sir, we've received complaints about unauthorized structures on your land," one of them said. I could see Karen standing at her porch, arms crossed, grinning like a villain watching her plan unfold. I invited the men in politely, letting them look around. They tried to act official, snapping photos, asking weird questions. But what they didn't know was that the county sheriff's office was already on their way, because I'd called them 15 minutes before they arrived. I wasn't bluffing this time. When the real officers pulled up, sirens flashing, the two fake inspectors froze. Karen's grin vanished as one of the officers shouted, "Hands where we can see them." The men dropped their phones immediately. Turned out, they weren't inspectors, they were private security she'd hired to create evidence of violations on my property. Karen tried to back away, but I stepped forward. "You really went this far over a warning sign?" I asked quietly. She muttered something about community standards and rules everyone must follow. But before she could finish, the sheriff walked up to me and said, "Sir, we've been looking into your property records. You own this entire section, HOA has no authority here." I glanced at Karen, her mouth slightly open, face pale. "Guess you should have checked the records before picking a fight," I said softly. But I wasn't finished yet. I pulled out my phone and played the new footage, her last night, planting the tracker under my truck. The sheriff's eyes widened. "That's tampering with private property," he said firmly. Karen stumbled, whispering, "That's not me." But her voice cracked halfway through. Viral line. She thought she could frame me, but she forgot, truth doesn't need permission to be seen. Karen's world started collapsing that same afternoon. The sheriff took her statement, but everyone in the neighborhood had already seen the patrol cars lined outside her house. Word spread fast. People who once waved at her now crossed the street to avoid her glare. She tried to keep her head high, still pretending she was the victim, but the fear in her eyes said otherwise. A few days later, I received a letter from the HOA, claiming I had violated property maintenance rules. The signature at the bottom. Karen's. She doubled down, trying to use the board to strip my rights even after being caught. But this time, I didn't react with anger. I just smiled, because the board didn't know one little detail: I had been a federal property lawyer for 12 years. That evening, I walked into the HOA meeting, uninvited. Every member froze as I placed a thick folder on the table. "Before you continue this circus," I said, "I suggest you read these." Inside were property maps, ownership deeds, and video proof of Karen's harassment. Karen laughed nervously. "You can't just barge in here," she snapped. I looked her in the eye. "Actually, I can. Because your so-called HOA charter is invalid in this zone." The room went silent. The president of the board adjusted his glasses, flipping through the papers. "He's right," he murmured, eyes widening. "This area isn't even under our jurisdiction." Karen froze completely, color draining from her face. Then came the final blow. I opened a video on my phone and cast it to the projector. It showed Karen planting that tracker, yelling at the fake inspectors, and slipping the fake notice under my door. Gasps filled the room. Someone whispered, "She did all that." Karen's voice cracked. "You set me up," she screamed. I replied calmly, "No, Karen. You set yourself up. I just pressed record." She tried to storm out, but a board member stopped her. "Karen, until this is investigated, you're suspended from the HOA." The room erupted in murmurs as she stumbled toward the exit, her pride shattered in front of everyone she used to boss around. As she reached the door, I said the words that would haunt her long after that meeting: "Next time you try to ruin someone's life, make sure they don't know the law better than you." Viral line. I didn't raise my voice. I raised evidence. The sun was setting when I pulled my truck into the driveway, quiet, peaceful, the way it used to be before all the chaos Karen brought. For the first time in weeks, the neighborhood felt calm. Kids were playing outside again, neighbors waved without fear of being reported, and Karen's once perfect front yard now sat empty, her "for sale" sign tilted in the grass. She didn't last long after the HOA suspension. The board turned on her, lawsuits started piling up, and when the police finally charged her with trespassing and property tampering, she vanished overnight. Some said she moved out of state. Others claimed she still drove by sometimes, watching from a distance. But to me, she was gone long before that, lost in her own need for control. A few weeks later, the sheriff stopped by one last time. He smiled and said, "You handled that better than most folks would've." I shrugged. "I just stood my ground," I said quietly. He nodded, looking at my sign still hanging strong on the gate, "Private property, trespassers will be towed." As he left, I leaned on my porch rail and watched the evening light wash over my land. Everything I'd fought for, my peace, my home, my right to live without fear, was still here. And that mattered more than any argument or revenge. I thought about Karen's words, "You don't know who I know." She was right. I didn't. But she also didn't know who I was, and that made all the difference. I walked inside, closed the door gently, and whispered to myself, justice doesn't always come loud, sometimes, it just parks quietly in your own driveway. Viral line. I didn't fight her to win, I fought her to protect what was already mine. The end.